I'm Pilar Marrero, Associate Editor of Ethnic Media Services. Welcome to today's Ethnic Media Services Zoom news conference. The topic of today's briefing is Democracy in Trouble, the Rise of Ethnic Voters. We had a series that ends today, for now, looking at what's going on in our democracy. And of course, this upcoming year, we have very crucial, very significant presidential elections. I know we always say the same thing, but experts are saying that this one is indeed very significant. And the ethnic voters, which are a lot of our audiences that we cover, are going to be key as always, because they are a growing demographic. So the so-called ethnic vote is always a major discussion during electoral cycles. That is obviously because as the demographics of the country continue to change, becoming less white and more diverse, so does the voting population. But how does political affiliation change over time? How about the new voters? What motivates them to register and vote, or not register and not vote? We know, for example, that 45% of the new Gen Z voters are people of color. Will they vote more or less than their white counterparts? This is, I'm hoping this is going to be the first of a few briefings that we plan examining different ethnic groups and their voting trends over the next few months. Speakers that were confirmed include Karthick Ramakrishnan, Professor of Public Policy at the University of California, Riverside, and founder of AAPI Data; Claudia Sandoval, Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Loyola Marymount University; Jamil Scott, Assistant Professor of Government at Georgetown University; Jessica Siles, Deputy Press Secretary at Voters of Tomorrow; and Tahin Perez, Deputy Director of Western Native Voices. We ask speakers to speak slowly for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean, and we ask reporters to enter questions in the chat, which we will address following each speaker as time allows. Our speakers are also encouraged to answer questions throughout the conference in the chat. We will send a video of today's briefing and expanded bios with contact information for each speaker to all participants later today. Okay, so let's see. Do we have all our participants? We have Karthick? Okay, there he is. Professor Ramakrishnan, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. And if it's okay, I can share some slides, but if it just needs to be a verbal briefing, I'm fine with that as well.
Whatever you feel is good. Go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm Karthick Ramakrishnan. I'm a professor of public policy at the University of California, Riverside, and I'm the founder and director of AAPI Data. I'm excited to present some recent findings, and I will preview some additional survey data that we will have over the coming months this year. So I'm going to try to share my screen, and hopefully you'll be able to see it.
Yep, it's showing up. Hold on. Says you started. Okay, perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to hit the slideshow.
Yeah.
So as this is coming up, my computer is a little bit slow, so it might take a second. So what I'm announcing today is something that we have launched this year with the Associated Press and NORC at the University of Chicago. And this partnership builds on a new panel called Amplify AAPI. And what's revolutionary about this panel is that it's a panel of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders with in-language support. I've been doing survey research on Asian American and Pacific Islander, as well as other communities, for 2 decades now. And this is the first time we've been able to have this, which will allow us to do regular monthly surveys of these important populations. When it comes to outreach connected with these surveys, we do community briefings as well as media briefings with our partners API Vote and the Asian American Journalists Association. In terms of the strengths that each of us brings, API Data brings over 15 years of survey experience in API communities, expertise in social science research and community engaged research, and a focus on public impact. At API Data, we use a framework that we developed called DNA, which is data, narrative, and action. This is why we love working with journalists, because we can provide the data, but it's those community narratives and the work that you do that is so important when it comes to interpretation and how we make meaning out of this data. And then importantly, for community organizations to use both data and narratives to compel action. Hopefully you're familiar with the Associated Press, which has longstanding expertise in data journalism with high trust and credibility. Importantly, the briefings, we're pleased to come to these briefings every single time there's an opportunity. Our next briefing for community and journalists alike will be on December 15th. And if you go to apivote.org under events, you should be able to sign up for that. NORC at the University of Chicago is a global leader in objective, nonpartisan research with a stellar reputation in social science and survey methodology, and they have a strong partnership with the Associated Press on data-informed storytelling. There's a lot more about the methodology and the qualities of the Amplify AAPI panel on which this is built, and I'm happy to answer that in the question and answer session. In terms of key findings that we released on November 15th, we had findings on presidential candidate favorability as well as other topics. We find that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are viewed more favorably than unfavorably by majorities of AAPI adults, and majorities of AAPI adults view Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis unfavorably. We also find that more AAPI adults have unfavorable views of Nikki Haley and Vivek Ramaswamy than favorable views. This is important because when I get asked by reporters about where Asian Americans stand on Haley and Ramaswamy, these are Asian American candidates, now we have data. And what they say is that there's more unfavorable than favorable opinion. And a large proportion don't know enough about the candidates to even form an opinion. So this is important context to have. So if you are covering these candidates and you're wondering what Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders feel on these candidates, we have the data on that. We also have data on partisanship, which you can read there. We also had questions about hate crimes and hate incidents and about thinking of racism as a serious problem. So 86% of AAPIs say that racism is a serious issue in this country, including 51% who say that it's extremely serious. And we have some variation there in terms of differences within the community, including partisanship, speaking English or another language at home, or having personally experienced a hate crime. When it comes to hate crimes and hate incidents, we find that a third of AAPI adults report experiencing some kind of hate incidents, including verbal harassment at 23% and being called racial slurs at 22%. And then with the more serious incidents of hate crimes, and we use the Department of Justice definition of either violence or either physical assault or damage to property, or threats of physical assault or damage to property, we find that about 1 in 6 say that they've been a victim of a hate crime as defined by the Department of Justice. So just to put this in context, the actual reports of hate crimes to federal authorities or other law enforcement authorities is much, much lower than what our survey data tell us. Finally, on mental health and anxiety, we find that 69% of AAPI adults say that their mental health is very good or excellent. 23% say that it's good, and 8% say that it's fair or poor. We also have another measure of generalized anxiety disorder, the GAD scale, and there we find that 12% of AAPI adults are at a moderate to high risk of anxiety, and you see the results there in terms of particular component parts. I'm just going to quickly show you our ability to break down by ethnicity, for example. You will find these results if you go to aapidata.com/surveys. You will find the video recording from our last briefing, as well as the ability to break down data by ethnicity, but also by gender, by age, and by partisanship, among other factors. So I will leave it at that. And thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Ramakrishnan. It's very important that you're doing this because I heard you say in a recent, I think it was on NPR, you were interviewed saying that just the mainstream polling doesn't really poll out Asian Americans well. So I guess we have to take that into account when we hear polls from the mainstream and they have opinions about how people of color vote. What's your comment on that?
Yes, two things, right? So one is that when surveys, so most of the times when it comes to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, they might never interview them at all. B, they might interview them but don't have enough sample size, so they will list them under other. Or C, they might report out the numbers, but they don't offer interviews in Asian languages. And so those results tend to be biased. When we've looked in the past, we've seen differences in the opinion, significant differences between those who take a survey in an Asian language versus taking it in English. Now, I will say that in our survey, we are able to offer language support in 3 languages, and these are 3 of the biggest language need groups in the Asian American community. So we have both Mandarin and Cantonese, we have Vietnamese and Korean. So we don't have support in other languages for groups, smaller populations with needs, and that's something that we hope to build over time. So when it comes to being a sophisticated consumer, if you're a journalist, I would say be skeptical when you see reports on Asian American data if they don't have Asian language support. And B, please check this out. So one of the strengths of our partnership is that in our top line data that you will find if you go through our website, you'll go to this data download of results at AP NORC. In some cases, we're able to make comparisons to the general population because we're using the exact same question wording that the Associated Press has used in the past. Our hope in the future is that with the Amplify AAPI panel, that this will become regular so that we don't need to have special surveys on our population, and instead that they will be included in more general surveys of the American public.
Thank you. Before you go, because I know you have to step out, there's a question from Henrietta Burrows. I think that's she needs to ask the question.
Sure.
Henrietta?
Yeah, and I was able to clear a little bit more time too, so I can stay a little bit longer. One thing I'll just say is a preview on December 15th. And in fact, the results might be released by the Associated Press a day prior to that. Watch out for misinformation. So I'm given the topic of this session, that we have data on that and the relatively high levels of concern among Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders when it comes to misinformation in the coming year.
That's very important and also their concern about racism and attacks against the community. Henrietta, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thanks. Do the survey respondents say why they have an unfavorable rating of the 2 candidates of Asian ethnicity? And also the breakdown for the AAPI hate crimes and incidents. Does that break it down for Pacific Islanders also, who seem to have a lower rate of being victimized?
Yes. So I'll take the second question first. If you go to our website, you'll see the results whenever we can break it down by ethnicity or say for Pacific Islanders separate from Asian Americans. So you will find that data there. When it comes to Vietnamese Americans, you will notice that we don't have large enough sample sizes and reliability to be able to report it out at this time. We hope to have that capability over the next several months. In terms of why you see these unfavorable results, it's because Asian Americans at about a 2-to-1 ratio identify as Democrat over Republican. And this has been fairly stable over time if you look at the racial group as a whole. For particular groups like Vietnamese Americans, you see some variation over time. So that's why. So these are 2 Republican candidates. And so you're seeing more unfavorable because of that. So the question, if you want to write a story about it, is, does race and ethnicity trump, no pun intended, does it overrule party identification when it comes to voter preferences? And the answer is no. Like, party identification is important. Now, it is true that party identification among Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is not as strong for them as it is for other populations, but it still matters. And so it's going to be relatively rare for someone who identifies as a Democrat or a strong Democrat to have a favorable opinion of Nikki Haley or Vivek Ramaswamy.
let's take advantage of the fact that you're going to be here for a little bit longer. And I received a direct question from Sunita, who's recording in another language, so she can't ask it. So as your data shows, a large number of AAPIs are registered independents. How have they typically voted, and how does either party capture this large block of voters?
Thank you for that question. So one thing I'll just say as reporters, if you have a chance to ask the researchers, is to talk both about party identification. So first of all, there's a difference between party registration and party identification. So you might register as no party preference, but identification is something you say in a survey in terms of how you feel, right? And whether you either identify or if you lean more closer to one party or another. So these are two different concepts. Another thing to note is that you can just talk about, even when it comes to identification, the three-party scale of Republican, Independent, and Democrat. You can either have what they call leaners, people who lean towards a party, included in that measure or excluded in that measure. So the proportion that are independent is actually quite large if you do not include those who lean towards the party. But if you look at those who lean towards either party, it's a similar ratio of about 2 to 1. So this is, and by the way, there's variation within the community. So what I've seen over the last 15 years of doing this work is that Indian Americans and Japanese Americans tend to be among those that are the most strongly Democratic. And if you look at those that are among the weakest Democratic or even tilting in the Republican direction, it tends to be Vietnamese Americans. We have seen variation in the Chinese American community over time, in which they moved closer to the Republican Party when it came to the 2016 election, but they moved away from the Republican Party under Trump. With Indian Americans, we saw some movement towards the Republican Party between 2016 and 2020, but Indian Americans are still among the strongest Democratic Party supporters. And that's why it's interesting that you have Ramaswamy and Haley that are Indian Americans on the Republican side. Of course, there are Indian American Republicans, and some of them are doing quite well when it comes to leadership positions in the party, but they are far from the mainstream and far from the middle when it comes to Indian American voter opinion.
Quickly, Henrietta has a follow-up, and I'm going to read it. She said, you mean party affiliation is more important than the candidates stand on the issues? Did you say that?
Yeah, so when it comes to candidates, so this is, so the classic literature, and so great to see my colleague Claudia Sandoval here. The classic political science literature says that partisanship is actually, people's opinions on issues are more shaped by their party identification than the other way around. Now, there are exceptions for people who have non-existent party identification or very weak party identification. Positions on issues can change them over time. So it does make a difference at the margins. But for Asian Americans, as for other groups, if you're looking at people who identify with the party, and especially if they've voted over several elections for one party versus another, it's their party identification that's going to then shape their opinion on the issues. So, for example, if your opinions on items ranging from taxes to environmental protection and so many other things, if you identify as a Republican, no matter what you thought about on the issues, over time, your Republican identity will start shaping that. And similarly on the Democratic side. Now, I would say that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are more persuadable, and issues do matter in that persuasion. But it's not that 100% of the population is persuadable, right? Maybe upwards of 50% is persuadable. I would say only probably about a quarter to a third of Asian American Pacific Islander communities are persuadable, and issues do matter in that persuasion.
Thank you so much, Professor Ramakrishnan. We have to move on because we have other speakers. And I'm going to go to Claudia Sandoval, Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Loyola Marymount University here in LA. Claudia, bienvenida.
Yes, thank you, Karthick. So nice to see you, and everybody else here. Thank you so much for having me, Pilar. Thank you so much for the invitation. So I know my time is limited, so I want to highlight the 3 areas that I'll be discussing on Latino voters. I'm going to talk a little bit about the youth vote, gender gaps, and mobilization. And at the end, I'm going to answer a couple of questions that are more general, questions that I think are of interest for this question of the Latino vote. So I want to start off this discussion by highlighting that the 2024 presidential election will be the first time for 22% of Latino eligible voters, right, that will cast a vote in a presidential election. A third, or 38%, of the Latino electorate is new to the political sphere since 2016, right? So 38% since 2016 are new. And according to data from Brookings, the number of eligible Latino voters has increased by 4.7 million additional voters, Latino voters, since 2018. So we're seeing quite a significant increase in Latino voters. And as Pilar mentioned earlier, this is due in large part to the fact that young Latinos are an important subgroup to the electorate. More specifically, young Latinos are making up a larger section of youth voters as more elections come to pass. So as elections continue to go by, more and more Latinos will become eligible to vote in local, state, and federal elections because they have come of age to vote. So while the median age for all eligible voters is closer to 50 years of age, the median age of the young Latino eligible voter, or Latino eligible voters, is 39 years of age. While we continue to think of the Latino population, and many people speak of the Latino population as a recent immigrant population whose newest voters are potentially older because they've naturalized at an older age, the reality is that US born and US raised Latinos are the ones who are truly changing America's demographic and political landscape. So we can think about decisive votes in places like Nevada and Arizona. These are two states where we're seeing an increase in the Latino youth voters, and where young Latinos make up a large portion of newly eligible voters. These are also states where support for Biden has decreased and support for Trump has slightly increased over the last couple of elections. So in Nevada, for example, from 2016 to the 2020 election, Biden lost support from Latinos by 4%, while Trump gained an 8% advantage. So we're talking 29% in 2016, going up to 37% support for Trump in 2020. In Arizona, Trump gained 3% votes. In other important states like Iowa, Georgia, and Florida, Trump continued to see small gains in the Latino voting bloc. So arguably, however, these gains were not coming from all Latinos or all young Latino voters, right? There are still gender gaps that are prominent across the board. So with Latino men more likely to support Republican candidates, and Republican candidates like Trump specifically. In states like Arizona, Texas, Nevada, Florida, and even California, more Latinos supported Trump than their female counterparts. In Nevada, with Nevada seeing the most sizable difference between men and women at 48 and 24% respectively. Breaking that down further to my previous point, we do see that young Latino men are also most sympathetic to Trump and other Republican candidates. These numbers, however, do not necessarily point to a moving Latino vote to the Republican Party. Okay, so we've seen Latinos vote for Republican candidates in much larger numbers. At their highest point in 1980, 1984, and 2000, over 35% of Latinos voted for the Republican candidate. And in 2004, that number shot up to 40% of the Latino vote. While the numbers in support of a Republican candidate have slightly increased in the last couple of elections, we are not necessarily near the 40% peak that we saw in support of George W. Bush in 2004. Perhaps the best explanation, and this might sound like it's a contradiction to what Karthick was mentioning, but I actually agree with him as well. But the best explanation that we can offer for the support is found in the candidates themselves. Ronald Reagan in the 1980s was, and in many households still, is seen as a champion of immigration reform, specifically for Mexican immigrants, right? Similarly, George W. Bush also enjoyed some Latino support since his time as governor of Texas, thanks to his bipartisan positions on immigration. Interestingly, while Trump is not seen as a supporter of progressive immigration reform, voters do tend to see him as an independent from the Republican Party. So the support we're seeing for Trump is not equivalent to the support we see for other for the Republican Party as a whole, but we do see some support for him as an independent candidate. And we'll talk a little bit about where that support lies if it's not specific to immigration. So what is important to understand about this difference is that even with differing voting patterns among men and women, the majority of Latino voters still have attitudes and policy preferences that lean to the left. And yet, I also would not argue that the Democratic Party can, as we say in Spanish, cantar victoria, or sing victory. Latinos' policy attitudes do not necessarily cement their support for the Democratic Party, right? In fact, while only 4% of young Latino voters believe that the Democratic Party is hostile to the Latino community, 37% of those Latino voters do believe that Biden and the party, the Democratic Party, do not necessarily care about the Latino community. On the other side, while 22% believe that the Republican Party is hostile to the Latino community, a third of young Latino voters believe that the Republican Party cares a great deal about Latinos. These numbers show us that the complicated nature of Latino political preferences, attitudes, and potentially identification, political identification. The next important thing to note is that, like with all other voters, none of these complicated differences or nuances matter unless Latinos actually show up to vote. That is why mobilization is such an important piece to the story of the Latino vote. Older academic scholarship reminds us of the importance of party mobilization across the board. The more that political parties invest in canvassing for their candidates, the higher voter turnout that we'll see. Yet we also know that parties have always fallen short of investing in the Latino vote and for other communities of color. More recent scholarship points to the influence of grassroots canvassing, so organizations, grassroots organizations that do the canvassing and the mobilization on the ground that would help candidates and policies that could potentially benefit the Latino community. I'd argue that parties need to wake up and realize that they hold some power, not all of the power, to bring the Latino vote or the power of the Latino vote forward. If the parties themselves invested in mobilization efforts, we might see Latino voter turnout that hasn't been seen since Obama's elections, maybe even more, potentially. I want to remind you all of the LA mayoral race that happened last year. And while I know this is incredibly local and specific to the LA area, I think this race can offer some insights into the importance of investing and mobilizing the Latino vote. In 2022, Rick Caruso was hardly on any Latino votes radar, right? Caruso was a successful businessman but few Latino voters knew him to be an ally to Latino causes or even an advocate for broader progressive policies. Yet by the end of the race, Caruso had amassed a significant Latino following, specifically in places like the San Fernando Valley area. Anecdotally, I had more Latino students in my classes, in my political science classes, working on Caruso's campaign than I know of any student on campus working for the Karen Bass campaign. And Karen Bass had a much longer history of leadership in Los Angeles and with the Latino community. In fact, she was a co-founder of one of the largest multi-ethnic Black and Latino coalitions in Los Angeles. While the $104 million that Caruso spent on his campaign did not secure a win, I'd argue he demonstrated how a first-time politician was able to mobilize for him unlikely supporters. So with these initial thoughts, let me end by answering some broader questions that I think have been looming about the Latino vote. I can elaborate further on each of these points during the question and answers. So the first question is, are Latinos moving to Trump or the Republican Party? I'd argue that they may be more inclined to vote for Trump, but I do not believe that this is an exodus into the Republican Party. How significant is the Latino vote going to be? And this is tied to some of the comments I've made earlier. The Latino vote is going to be significant for decades to come. The important question is, will they yield to this power by going out to vote, right? What issues do Latinos care about? Like all other Americans and American voters, Latinos are heavily concerned with the economy, jobs, healthcare, crime, and housing, something that we were discussing earlier. These top concerns are no different than they are to their voting counterparts. So we shouldn't treat Latinos as single issue voters relegated only to conversations on immigration. And what are some of the challenges they may face? The biggest issues they face, as I've discussed again previously, is going to be that those mobilization efforts by the party, increasing their feeling of efficacy in the political process. As some of my colleagues have noted, anti-Latino prejudice in the campaign might be a challenge for Latinos, misinformation in social media, and also the potential for candidate choice. And this is true on both sides. Who the Democratic Party chooses for their candidate, obviously Biden is the candidate, but I'd argue that they should have thought about this for 2020, the election on 2020, but also the Republican Party thinking about who their candidates are going to be that represent them for the Latino vote. So I'm gonna go ahead and leave those comments for now, but I'll answer any questions.
Yes, thank you. There are 3 questions in the chat that I think I'm gonna summarize in one. And I'm gonna make some comments as well because I covered the Latino vote for so long. I was political editor for La Opinión for so long, Claudia. One question, why when Trump is a racist? Why move towards Trump when Trump is a racist? Second question, is there any truth to the belief that machismo views of young Latino men leads them to support Trump? Third question, hold on a second. How can Latino voters think the Republican Party cares about Latinos given Trump's border wall efforts and his speech calling the Latino immigrants criminals and rapists bringing diseases into the country? This is just like when people ask me, why are there Latino Republicans? Well, Latin America is a continent where there are conservatives, liberals, people on the left, people on the right, people who are racist, people who are machista, people who aren't. So, we have this view of Latinos as this monolith, right? We always discuss this. How can we start learning these differences? And why were Latinos trending Democratic and still are trending Democratic for so long? And why would that change?
Yeah, so I think the question here or the answer here is really, again, I don't think the support that Trump has is on immigration. I think the support that Trump has is on the the same reason that Caruso was able to garner some Latino support. And that's the idea of successful businessmen, right? This ideology that hard work could, because they're successful businessmen, they know how to run things, and that they might run it more successfully than a traditional politician. And I think for Latin Americanists, right, people who are coming from Latin America, even thinking about deep-rooted politicians, somebody who's outside of politics sounds better than somebody who's heavily rooted and heavily anchored in political leadership, right? Historically. So even for Karen Bass, her being a part of a political leadership that has expanded many years and decades in LA, Rick Caruso seemed better because he was a successful businessman, right? And so I think there's something about Latino voters seeing candidates who aren't rooted in politics as potentially good choices. And Trump has some of that, even when he does attack Latino migration, right? And some Latinos may not identify with a narrative of immigration anyways, right?
Some Latinos are anti-immigrant. Some Latinos are anti-immigrant.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
yeah.
the way it is. Claudia, I'm going to move on because I let people talk too long, and then we have two more speakers. But there are questions in the chat that you may be able to.
I can definitely answer.
Thank you. Gracias, Claudia. And I welcome now Jamil Scott, Assistant Professor of Government of Georgetown University. She's going to share some points about the African American vote. Welcome, Professor Scott.
Hello, thank you for having me. So when it comes to Black voters, I think we are facing less of a question in 2024 whether Black voters will change their partisanship broadly, and more of a question of how well Black voters will show up on election day. There's a big question about Black voter excitement that keeps coming up over and over again, whether or not Black people, how Black people feel about the current Biden administration and what that means. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But first, I want to talk about the numbers. So in 2020, the Black non-Hispanic vote share for Biden and Trump was 92% and 8% respectively. And we do need to talk about the Black gender gap here, right? That is large part of the conversation, and perhaps why the Biden administration has focused so much on Black women. But you can see the ways in which some of this conversation has lent to some backlash amongst Black men, right? This larger focus on Black women. So when we look at the numbers, it was Black women who overwhelmingly supported Biden at 95%, while Black men support was at about 87%. And so this question comes up over and over again. Is there an opportunity for the Republican Party vote to increase? Yes, marginally. And indeed it did increase, right? From 2016 to 2020, there's about a 2% increase amongst all Black people. So the Trump vote went from 6% to 8% from 2016 to 2020, right? And so I think what this means is that there's a dissatisfaction more broadly with the Democratic Party and Democratic Party offerings. That's particularly among young people. Young people are dissatisfied, and young people and more folks who are more liberal leaning, they're dissatisfied with what the party is offering. Democratic Party, that is. The hold your nose and vote conversation, quote unquote, or conversation is, or the hold your nose and vote conversation, or stay home is ongoing. And it's something that we see over and over again, whether or not people see 2024, particularly Black people see 2024 as a moment in which they need to show up for democracy, or are they tired, right? Are they tired of showing up and again and perhaps not necessarily seeing the policy benefits that they want to see? Why is that really important? Well, it's even more important right now because, as Claudia mentioned, communities of color are not necessarily being reached by parties, meaning parties aren't necessarily reaching out, right? And so it's grassroots organizations that are doing the work to mobilize and get people organized, get people registered. And you know, there's a reason why Stacey Abrams was a part of the conversation so heavily in 2020. And it was because it was her organization and similarly placed organizations that were getting Black people registered to vote and excited about voting in 2020. Now, it will be really important for organizations to do that work again. But there's an excitement issue here. What has Biden done, right? And so there have been some tangible things that the Biden administration can point to as accomplishments and maybe kept promises as we talk about it. Now, that'll be, I think, a refrain over and over again. What has Biden done? How has he kept his promises, particularly to Black voters? You know, as we think about the push to include South Carolina earlier in the primary conversation, because we know that there are Black voters there, right? What does that mean? And how are they showing up for Black voters, right? So we have the lowest unemployment record among Black Americans in a really long time, right? And that is notable. There have been new opportunities for small businesses and other bureaucratic agency-based solutions that impact the Black community, right? The administration can tout the 25 Black judges they've appointed, many of them Black women, right? We see the Supreme Court appointment of Ketanji Brown Jackson, that being important part of the conversation. But many of these things are visible, right? But not necessarily tangible in the ways that we might think about, you know, solutions and what people want to see, right? And so, you know, the fact that the USDA is working on resolving land title issues, that's important, right? That is an issue that Black people face in terms of not in terms of having questions around their land ownership and who can own land, right? That is important for the Black community. But, right, the promises were not just about these bureaucratic agency solutions, they were about legislation, right? And those are the things that Biden can't call a win. The Biden administration can't say that they've kept their promise on things like student loan forgiveness and voting rights. And certainly that conversation around student loan forgiveness is a bit complicated because there have been some shifts for some people, but not all, right? And so it's always tough when a president makes legislative promises because they can only come into fruition when the legislative branch is on board with his agenda. And we know that there's a divided government to speak of, right? That we just got passed by a small margin, the chance of having a government shutdown, right? Which has real implications for people who work for the government, but particularly the city of DC, which houses which is home to a number of Black people, right? So I think the thing in this last minute or two, I'll say, is that Black voters they don't have the legislation to hang their hat on, but they do have rising costs of goods because of inflation to think about, and the additional burden of paying student loans again. And so we like to think that people are pocketbook voters, so they're going to think about their economic condition when they're considering voting. And while Black people are largely not going to change their partisanship, there will be a number of them who are going to be having that "do I hold my nose and vote" conversation, or am I just going to stay home? And the state of their pocketbooks is not necessarily giving them a compelling reason to show up on election day, especially when we know there are a number of challenges to voting, like longer wait times in communities of color. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so helpful. I had questions about that, but you have answered them. Let's move in and allow the fourth speaker to speak and then have questions. Unfortunately, our fifth speaker, Dahim Perez from Western Native Voices, had to step out of the briefing at the last minute for personal reasons, and he can't make it. We hope to bring the Native American voter and their voice in a future briefing. So let me invite Jessica Stiles. She is Deputy Press Secretary for Voters of Tomorrow, and this is an organization that she's going to tell us about. Jessica, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, my name is Jessica Solis. Thank you for that introduction. And it's a really hard act to follow up on these speakers. So informative. But I will try my best. So here, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what Voters of Tomorrow does, and then kind of dive into a little bit about youth turnout more generally and the issues that young voters really care about. So Voters of Tomorrow, our first and primary goal is to basically just represent Gen Z in politics. We feel like younger generations have in the past consistently kind of not been given a seat at the table. So that's what we do. We try to also engage and empower Gen Z and inform Gen Z to be more civically engaged. We are completely Gen Z led too, which is a really cool thing about our organization. We have different chapters which focuses more on local politics, and we have chapters in about 20 states and volunteers in all 50. So in terms of like actions that we take too, we conduct our own polling and research to try to help decide how we can best represent Gen Z and exactly where Gen Z kind of stands on certain things. And we use this to inform our own policy and legislative platform that we call the Gen Z Agenda. And we lobby for this agenda and push for these priorities. And our work also goes past Election Day. We engage elected officials. We have this initiative called the Youth Vote Champion Pledge, which we basically ask members of Congress and different elected officials to commit to engaging and kind of representing Gen Z. And yes, as Pilar mentioned, we were founded in 2019 by Santiago Mayor, a passionate immigrant from Mexico. And so that also kind of guides our priorities as well. So some things that we've done recently, in the 2022 election, we contacted millions of young voters, specifically on social media, and we organized on the ground in over 20 states. And just this past election in November in 2023, we also organized in Virginia, for example. We made 300,000 phone calls to young voters and knocked on thousands of doors, just really trying to get people engaged and explain why it's so important for young people to be active in our political sphere, especially at times like this. So that's a little bit about us and what we do. In terms of Gen Z as a voting bloc in general, again, I think previous speakers touched on this beautifully, but we are extremely racially and ethnically diverse, more so than any previous generation. And we're also a generation kind of characterized by our unity in our action. Young people have been marching in the streets for change. And I think this is because we kind of have some shared experiences growing up, especially when it comes to gun violence prevention measures, climate action. We really have had these things that have kind of thrown some people into being politically active. Now, this does translate kind of the same as older generations when it comes to disparities within the voting bloc. There are still disparities when it comes to race and gender, when it comes to who is voting. For example, Black and Latino voters are lower within the youth spaces. The Asian population is not that much far behind the white population, but there are still some disparities, and young women vote at a slightly higher rate. But one thing that all youth currently share, and why we like to say that we're a fairly united voting bloc, is that we tend to vote left-leaning. In 2022, for the House of Representatives, Tufts Center for Information and Research on Civic Engagement found that for the House of Representatives, young people voted Democrat by a 28-point margin. And again, those kind of break down differently in different subgroups, but across the board, young people really voted for certain issues. And that's something else we found is it's not that young people are just super loyal to the Democratic Party. It's that we care about a few core issues and we continue to vote on that behalf. So in terms of turnout, a lot of people like to point to how low these numbers are for youth voter turnout, but we've actually seen that they're increasing, and we believe that they will continue to increase. To put it into perspective, you might see like a low percentage of young voters voting, but my generation actually has had the highest youth voter turnout for the cohort of 18 to 24%. And I think it's like 30 years. So basically 2022 election was the first midterm election that Generation Z made up the entire 18 to 24 age block. And they voted at a higher rate than millennials, Gen X, and boomers did in their generation's first midterm election, when those generations were the most of the young voting bloc. And that was at 28.4%. And again, the next level is 23.5% of the Gen Xers who voted in 1990. So that's a little significant difference too. And again, we do think that this is going to continue to move. In 2018, the youth voter bloc was a little bit higher than 2022, but that was also a presidential election. So we also don't think it's quite fair to like truly just compare the two numbers wise without that context. In terms of barriers, we have a lot of the same issues that other age groups have, and a lot of different barriers within these subgroups. But one thing in youth vote particular that is cited is a lack of engagement and a lack of information. A lot of youth voters report that they were never contacted by people running for office in the same ways that different generations have been. And information on their political candidates are not as accessible. And that's because young people tend to get a lot of their information from different places. And so not only do we believe that candidates running for office need to meet people where they are, young people where they are online, but they also need to show up to college campuses and hubs for where youth voting blocks are, and actually put in some effort to actually engage on a serious level the youth vote. In terms of issues, we have conducted our own polling, and the economy is actually the #1 issue that we found Gen Z to care about. Young people are workers and taxpayers. I think a lot of times that gets kind of overlooked, but we're extremely concerned about our ability to pay for a house and find a good job. And that is really motivating young voters as well. But also definitely abortion rights, climate action, and gun violence prevention continue to rank in the top issues as well. And we've seen how this mobilizes young voters. I think Ohio this past year was a great example of how young voters will continue to show up for abortion rights. And all of that kind of goes to say is that we are expecting some of the same trends to continue in terms of young voters leaning left. I know there's been some confusing polling out there, but when it comes to some of these issues like climate change and abortion, there's only one party that I think youth voters, even if they're not 100% happy with that, that is somewhat acceptable. So we are going to continue to see that.
Thank you, Jessica. I think the question, much like Professor Scott say, is whether they will show up. And Professor Scott, I wanted to ask you about this. You said that, but also there's been some polling recently that shows that, I don't know if Quinnipiac University poll is something you look at, but recently found only 65% of Black voters approve of Biden. That sounds low for the Black vote. So what should journalists like us, what should we look at in this election period in terms of how to really cover the Black vote and not just, go with this kind of all over the place polling that we see?
Yeah, so I think one of the things to think about here is this question of not just whether or not how much people approve, but their willingness to turn out on election day. I think that's the bigger question. We've seen over and over again where Black voters have perhaps been dissatisfied with the Democratic Party, but they still showed up. We can point to perhaps the implications of when Black voters didn't show up in 2016, right? We had these popular conversations around, you know, we're dissatisfied, but what are our options here? And there was a conversation about not coming out on election day, right? And that conversation was reversed in 2020 to vote by any means, right? So it wasn't that Black voters were necessarily changing their partisanship. It's about, are they going to show up on election day? There are a number of things that Black voters have not been satisfied with for a long time. It is telling that at this point in time, we are just getting to record number unemployment, right? And yet, and still Black people were still supporting the Democratic Party. So it's a question of willingness to turn out and excitement about election day, which I think is the important question.
Thank you. Jessica, what do you think about barriers for participation for youth voters? Are you worried about that? And what are you planning to do in your organization to help?
Yeah, so we have found that transportation and voter IDs are also barriers for young voters. And again, that also breaks down, and that becomes even more of an issue when it comes to minority voters. So things that we have supported are like rideshare programs and physically mobilizing and enabling people to carpool to the polls, and also just pushing for things like the Youth Vote Champion Pledge, where we're asking our representatives to commit and sign something that says that they are going to engage young voters and go out of their way to do so. And that, again, comes to organizing on college campuses and on campuses and on social media and digitally, taking that seriously.
Thank you. Let's do one more round, and we're going to go a little bit over the noon time. Thank you so much for being with us. Let's start with Claudia. What is one story that you wish we would cover about the Latino vote, Claudia?
I mean, I think for me, much like Dr. Scott just mentioned, it's the mobilization, but the importance of the parties mobilizing the voters, right? We do have organizations, and we rely heavily on particular subgroups to do the heavy lifting for the political parties to get ethnic voters out on election day or election week, or sending out their ballots. But the parties, one, have the funding and have the responsibility to excite the population, right? As I just mentioned on the chat, very few voters of color, I would argue, were excited about a Trump Biden presidency. But we also knew that Biden was better than Trump, right? And so they had to do the heavy lifting to get Biden elected, even if he wasn't that excitable for the population. And so I think it's listening to the population, mobilizing the population, and really steering away from, I think there's true, if something isn't broken, don't fix it. But the Democratic Party is a little bit broken, and they should try to fix it, and they should try to revitalize it a bit. And so in speaking for the Democratic Party and left leaning, I think they have to do a lot of work, which I think they have been lacking for decades at this point, because they rely on strong ethnic voters. And the Republican Party benefits from that in a lot of ways, right? And I think that's why we end up with these conversations about, are Latinos becoming Republican? I don't think they're becoming Republican. The data doesn't actually really show that they're becoming any more Republican than they ever have been. As I pointed out, there's been peaks at other points where they've been much higher than we are now. But the conversation goes there because there is dissatisfaction with the traditional the traditional arrow of where the voting is going, and that's the Democratic Party, and they're not listening. And so I would like to see more stories that are pushing parties to do what they are funding or fundraising for, right? Actually use the money for canvassing, for getting people out to vote.
Thank you, Claudia. Jamil, please go ahead with that same question.
So to add to Dr. Sandoval's point, I'm sorry for being informal earlier. To add to Dr. Sandoval's point earlier here, I think that part of this conversation is how parties and campaigns think about who's part of their staff, right? In 2020, we saw this important conversation happening about what happens when you are inclusive of people of color on your staff who can, and not just in a role in which they're thinking about specific demographic outreach, right? Oftentimes people of color are included in those, how do we reach out to this group, right? And as Dr. Sandoval said, they don't necessarily get the money to do that outreach, but when there's more inclusion of people on staff who are saying, this is how we do this better, right? This is how we think more inclusively about communities of color and how they matter as part of this conversation, I think you get better outcomes. You get better moments with candidates, right? Even though Elizabeth Warren didn't win, right? It was so meaningful that Elizabeth Warren showed up to that Black Women's Roundtable, right? And it could have been the case that she didn't go, right? But she had key people on her staff who said, this is an event you should go to, right? And it matters that candidates are being thoughtful about who's on who's part of their campaign, and that extends to parties thinking about and raising the voices of these campaign professionals of color.
Jessica, the younger party in this conversation, the future. I'm gonna let you have the last word.
Oh, thank you. Well, again, so hard to follow that up. I second the mobilization issue. I think that is so accurate that these parties have the funding and capability to excite young voters as well, and that needs to happen. But to be different, I would also like to see the parties and more stories about young people running for office and taking more of a direct, participation in democracy. We've endorsed some Gen Z candidates. We endorsed Maxwell Frost when he became the first Gen Z member of Congress. But I think in order to have a true seat at the table, we need more direct representation. And I would love to see a push in mentorship and recruiting and really throwing support behind Gen Z and young candidates to make that representation more available.
So much for all the panelists. I love this discussion. I hope we have more of these during the year. Thank you to Dr. Sandoval, Dr. Scott, Jessica South, Dr. Ramakrishnan for being with us. I appreciate it. And thank you to my colleagues. Have a nice weekend, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.